cognitive interfaces.
Chapter 7. Self-control, the emotional labyrinth, and the alchemy of being. Are we truly masters of our reactions, or can any external stimulus hack our emotions and decisions? In this chapter, we will explore self-control from multiple perspectives to understand how to recover that inner command. We will delve into modern analogies that compare our mental patterns to algorithms and our perception filters to cognitive interfaces. We will journey through personal development teachings that underscore the importance of mastering the mind. We will retrieve historical and philosophical lessons on temperance. We will explore literary representations of the inner struggle, and we will also investigate mystical symbols and techniques of inner transformation that illustrate the art of governing oneself. The tone will be reflective, practical, and emotional, seeking to connect these wisdoms with everyday experience. Let us then embark on this journey toward the center of self-control, that point of equilibrium where our emotions cease to be enemies and become allies. Mental algorithms and cognitive interfaces. Let us imagine for a moment that our mind is like an operating system full of mental algorithms, logical sequences that dictate how we react to certain stimuli. For example, when someone makes a personal criticism of us, the algorithm, if I perceive attack then respond with anger, might automatically activate. These are thought patterns programmed by previous experiences, accumulated beliefs, and emotions. Now, these algorithms do not act in a vacuum. They operate within a cognitive interface, that is, the way our mind presents reality to us. Each of us perceives the world through certain mental filters, beliefs, expectations, mood, that function like the graphical interface of a program, highlighting some aspects of reality and dimming others. If our filters are tinted by susceptibility or fear, we will interpret others' words according to that tonality. Just as an application can display different data depending on user settings, our mind can show us the same situation as an intolerable insult or as a criticism without ill intent, depending on the internal settings with which we view it. The good news is that, unlike a fixed machine, human beings can reprogram our mental algorithms and adjust our cognitive interfaces. Becoming aware of them is the first step. If we identify that hidden code, for example, when someone contradicts me, I experience it as a personal affront, we can intervene to change the default response. Instead of automatically executing the anger algorithm, we can insert a pause, a self-control subroutine that allows us to evaluate the situation more objectively. Similarly, we can debug our mental filters by questioning limiting beliefs. Did they really mean to attack me, or am I projecting my own insecurities? And adopting a broader perspective. It's like updating the internal operating system with a more stable and friendly version, one that doesn't crash at every provocation, but processes events with calm and clarity. A practical resource is to literally visualize that mental interface. For example, some psychologists suggest imagining that we see the situation projected on a screen. We can enter settings and lower the emotional volume or change the color filter of the scene, perhaps from an aggressive red to a calm blue, and then play the desired response. These technological analogies make clear the idea that we have an active role as designers of our internal experience. Self-control, ultimately, is the ability to become the programmer of one's own mind, instead of remaining a simple user subject to programs installed by default. Self-mastery and personal growth. From the perspective of personal development, self-control has been identified as a fundamental pillar for success and individual freedom. Pioneers of self-improvement essentially maintained that whoever manages to master themselves can better direct their destiny. In classic studies on success, self-control is described as the ability to dominate and direct our emotions, desires, and impulses instead of being dominated by them. Without this capacity, they warn, we become slaves to our whims, fears, and impulsive reactions and easily stray from our deepest objectives. In contrast, by exercising self-control, we can choose how to respond in a situation instead of reacting automatically. This translates to having the lucidity when faced with a negative stimulus, like that annoying comment from a loved one, to pause, breathe, and consciously decide our response instead of exploding on the spot. Why is this faculty so important for achieving our goals? because it allows us to channel the energy of our emotions toward constructive ends. A reference in the genre wrote that the burning desire for achievement is key to success, but if that desire is not controlled, it can scatter or be directed toward wrong objectives. For example, the desire for recognition can degenerate into vanity or reckless actions if we don't measure our emotions. The desire for justice can become blind revenge if we don't temper it with prudence. Self-control then acts as a channel. It helps us filter and harness the force of our desires and emotions instead of letting them overflow and cause havoc. Managing difficult emotions, especially potentially destructive ones like anger, envy, or fear, is crucial so they don't cloud our judgment or damage our relationships. Another practical aspect of self-control noted by positive mindset mentors is the capacity to resist temptations and distractions that divert us from our goals. Modern life offers us multiple escape routes and instant gratification, from compulsively checking our phone at any notification to abandoning an important task for something more pleasant in the moment. Without a dose of self-control, it's easy to yield to these momentary temptations and lose sight of our long-term objectives. Cultivating self-control means developing a certain tolerance for present discomfort in pursuit of a more significant future benefit. It's the famous marathon effect versus 100-meter sprint effect. Learning to pace and sustain effort, to postpone immediate rewards to achieve greater accomplishments later. The encouraging thing is that self-control is not a fixed trait one is born with or not, but a skill that can be trained and strengthened with daily practice. Just like a muscle that grows with resistance, our capacity for self-mastery expands each time we manage to say no to a harmful impulse or yes to a useful discipline. It's suggested to start with small daily challenges. For example, waiting a few seconds before responding when something irritates us, getting up early despite laziness, completing that exercise routine even without feeling like it, etc. Each small victory over oneself strengthens character and facilitates greater victories in the future. Over time, we'll notice that what once overwhelmed us, for example, criticism from others, begins to have less power over us because we have internally built a muscle of patience, serenity, and clarity in the face of emotion. Finally, in the philosophy of personal growth, it is affirmed that our dominant thoughts tend to manifest in our reality. If we live thinking negatively, reactive, and letting ourselves be carried away by anger or defeatism, it's more likely we'll enter cycles of failure or conflict, partly because we sabotage our actions or because we interpret everything in the worst way. In contrast, if we cultivate a positive and self-controlled mental attitude, that is, if we consciously choose to focus the mind on solutions, on learning, on maintaining calm, we end up generating a more propitious environment and attracting opportunities in tune with that vibration. Although it sounds almost mystical, it has a practical basis. A person who doesn't let themselves be dragged by fits of anger will be able to converse and negotiate better with others, so they'll solve their problems sooner. Someone who maintains motivation despite difficulties will keep trying where another would give up, so sooner or later, they'll find a way out. Thus, self-control and success go hand in hand because governing our emotions allows us to persevere with focus, relate healthily, and make intelligent decisions even under pressure. In simple words, if you control your mind, you control your life. If we think about it, this ancient wisdom applies perfectly to the situation narrated at the beginning. The goal would not be for the protagonist not to feel anger at a hurtful comment, which would be almost inhuman, but that even feeling it, he maintains command of his actions, using the emotion perhaps to clarify a boundary or deepen understanding with his partner, instead of using it to verbally attack her. Throughout history, many religions and ethical currents have also valued self-control under various forms: temperance, chastity, fasting, meditation, etc., all practices oriented toward strengthening will over impulses. In the Christian tradition, for example, uncontrolled anger is cataloged among the 7 deadly sins, and meekness and patience are exalted as counterparts. In Eastern philosophies like Buddhism, the equanimous management of mind and emotions is central to liberating oneself from suffering. Meditation teaches observing with detachment the thoughts and feelings that arise, avoiding compulsive reaction to them. Each culture has recognized in its own way that in that inner dominion resides a great power. In the contemporary world, paradoxically, self-control acquires a new dimension. On one hand, modern psychology confirms many ancient intuitions. We know that people with greater self-control tend to be happier and more successful because they navigate stress better, build more solid relationships, and achieve their objectives more effectively. On the other hand, we also face unprecedented challenges. We live surrounded by stimuli designed precisely to hijack our attention and provoke our emotions. The information economy and social networks, for example, constantly exploit our emotional reactions. It has been observed that the easiest way to keep someone hooked to a screen is to present content that outrages, scares, or enrages them. Internet algorithms show us what they know will trigger some passion in us: alarming headlines, offensive opinions, provocative images, because by reacting viscerally, even with rage or fear, we spend more time consuming and commenting. In the words of a contemporary thinker, today one doesn't govern with ideas, but with fear and rage. Whoever manages to manipulate people's emotions can influence their decisions. It's evident then that self-control transcends the individual and becomes almost a citizen defense. If we don't control our emotions, someone out there will do it in our place for their own benefit. Governments, companies, and various propagandas try to hack human psychology. Only a person conscious of their internal triggers and capable of self-regulation can better resist these onslaughts. In fact, experts at the intersection of technology and behavior warn that human beings have become hackable in the 21st century. This means that through massive data analysis and advances in understanding the mind, external entities can predict and manipulate our emotional reactions with remarkable precision. From which ad will make us buy, to which fake news will make us vote a certain way. If we don't know ourselves, if we don't train a minimum of self-control, we remain very vulnerable to these influences. In contrast, cultivating mindfulness and critical reflection, we recover agency. We stop being mere reactors to stimuli and become conscious actors. Here, we see how an ancient skill gains modern relevance. Practices like meditation, personal journaling, or simply the habit of pausing and questioning before believing or acting are tools of mental self-control that protect us in the age of information overload. A modern historian who is also a meditation practitioner noted that our mind is full of fictions and illusions, largely because truth tends to be complex and painful, and we prefer simple narratives. We tend to tell ourselves stories about ourselves, about others, that justify our immediate emotions. Various currents, from philosophy to neuroscience, agree that inner clarity is key to freedom. Only if we recognize our own shadows and self-deceptions can we free ourselves from automatic reactions and respond to the world as it is, not as our fears paint it. In summary, history teaches us that self-control has been appreciated as a strength of character, a refuge against chaos, in the words of a current author. Today, in an environment full of forces competing to trigger our passions, this strength is more relevant than ever. Practicing self-mastery allows us to navigate against the current of collective impulsivity. Just as in the middle of a storm, a navigator seeks calm within themselves to avoid shipwreck, in the midst of the modern vortex, each individual can seek in their interior that pool of control to not get lost in the surge of stimuli. Keeping a firm helm on oneself becomes an almost revolutionary act of personal autonomy. In the Labyrinth of Emotions, Visions from Literature. Great literary works, through their characters and plots, have deeply explored the human struggle for self-control and its consequences. Sometimes, fiction manages to represent our inner battles more vividly than any theory. A powerful example appears in a certain Argentine existentialist novel, where the narrator confesses, "My head is a dark labyrinth." Sometimes, there are like lightning flashes that illuminate some corridors. I never quite know why I do certain things. This image, the mind as a labyrinth in darkness, barely traversed by fleeting flashes of understanding, perfectly captures the sense of perplexity that remains after we have acted impulsively. Like that protagonist, we can feel we get lost in the corridors of our emotions and that we don't understand what hidden forces made us say or do this or that. The metaphor of the mental labyrinth reflects the disconnection between our actions and our consciousness. Why did I react that way? What hidden corner of my being was activated at that moment? Are questions that resonate after losing self-control. In the same story, the character suggests that the exit from that inner labyrinth lies in giving priority to reason over emotion at the moment of acting. He proposes that in any situation, it is necessary to deliberate, examine, and then decide, maintaining focus on our essential values so as not to lose the seed of who we really are. It is a call to think well before acting, to not let ourselves be blinded by the emotion of the instant. Unfortunately, in that novel's plot, the protagonist tragically fails to do so. His uncontrolled jealousy and obsessions lead him to commit an irreversible act. Literature thus puts us before extreme mirrors of our own reality. It shows us what could happen if we don't tame those dark impulses in time. As readers, we witness a character's self-destruction due to lack of self-control, and that leads us to reflect on our own everyday internal tempests, perhaps much smaller but potentially harmful as well. Many times, writers have symbolized uncontrolled emotions as dark forces that consume the individual. Hatred, anger, revenge, excessive jealousy. How many literary characters succumb to them and ruin their destiny? From classic tragedies where the hero is defeated by his blind rage to modern novels where anxiety or addiction finish off the protagonist, the underlying message is clear. Despairing, hating, or letting oneself be carried away by rage leads to an abyss that blinds our course. In the words of the cited text, we must not let despair, hatred, or rage consume us, for that leads us to an abyss and blinds our course. When we read these stories, we feel almost in our own flesh the warning. If we don't restrain those inner demons, we can lose everything we value. At the same time, literature offers us glimpses of hope and paths out. Just as there are labyrinths, there are also Ariadne's threads that guide toward the light. Some characters manage to overcome their unbridled passions through introspection, empathy, or redemption. Let us think of those plots where the protagonist, after an intense internal conflict, learns a lesson of moderation and changes their destiny. A universal example is that of the mythical hero who faces tests to master himself before conquering the external world. In a sense, every hero's journey in literature also represents an internal battle. The knight who defeats the dragon could be interpreted as the person who defeats their own anger or fear, that inner dragon. The treasure found at the end may well be the wisdom of self-control, peace with oneself. Writers have employed abundant symbols to portray this dynamic. The mirror is one. When a character looks in the mirror and faces their own eyes, it usually signifies a moment of self-awareness, of struggle with their reflection, which symbolizes their shadow, that which they don't want to see. A distorted mirror returns a monstrous image, just as a mind distorted by anger perceives monsters outside where perhaps there are none. Another recurring figure is the stormy night that reflects the character's inner agitation until it dawns in calm when they have resolved their conflict. Mystical writers, for their part, spoke of the soul as a temple where the battle between angels and demons is waged, that is, between our virtues and our vices. That inner temple can be profaned by uncontrolled passions or consecrated by consciousness and love. It should also be noted how our collective stories and myths have exalted self-control as a quality of heroes and leaders. Great epic heroes not only defeat external enemies, but first usually defeat their own doubts, their anger, or their ego. Let us think of those moments where the hero must contain their sword because they understand that the true victory lies in mercy, or when they resist the temptation of a dark power to remain faithful to their values. Through such stories, from childhood we absorb the idea that there is nobility in self-control, that therein lies true greatness. Of course, in everyday practice we are not medieval knights or mythical demigods, but on a small scale we face similar challenges. Yield to the easy reaction or act with virtue. Literature inspires us to choose the latter. Ultimately, the literary vision of self-control reminds us that within each one there is a labyrinth of emotions and reasons, populated by shadows and lights. Getting lost in it can mean losing everything. Finding a path in that interior is finding oneself. Stories invite us to be heroes of our own life, understanding that the most epic of conquests is, perhaps, that of our own heart. Inner alchemy, mystical wisdom and transformative symbology. Beyond psychology and literature, mystical and esoteric knowledge has addressed for centuries the theme of self-control, describing it in terms of spiritual transformation. In medieval alchemy, which at its core was as much a chemical quest as a metaphor for inner development, they spoke of transmuting lead into gold. This symbolic process can be read thus. Lead represents our densest and darkest elements, base passions, ignorance, anger, fear, while gold represents purity, illumination, virtue. The inner alchemist seeks to convert their rough emotions into wisdom and light. When we exercise self-control, in some way we are doing alchemy with our emotions. We take the raw energy of, for example, anger, and transform it into something useful and elevated. How? Perhaps into firmness to correct an injustice without violence, or into motivation to change what bothers us, or simply into self-understanding. Why did it affect me so much? Thus, the initial anger, that heavy lead, dissolves, purifies, and coagulates again in the form of gold, that is, in a conscious and constructive response. The Hermetic texts summarized this work in the formula solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. First, disintegrate the problem into its basic components, understand the origin of the emotion, break the automatic reaction, and then recombine those elements into a new, superior form, a learning, a positive action. In current terms, it would be like deconstructing our initial impulse and reconfiguring it with intention. Another relevant spiritual principle is that of correspondence. The ancient Hermetic maxim is often cited, as above, so below, as within, so without. This suggests a profound connection between our inner world and our external reality. Translated to our topic, inner chaos tends to manifest as chaos in our life, while inner harmony will be reflected in more harmonious circumstances. Many esoteric traditions insist on this idea. For example, in the teaching of yoga and meditation, it is said that a person's environment is ultimately a mirror of their mental state. Whoever cultivates inner peace projects peace around them. From Kabbalah, Hebrew mystical wisdom, to Western Hermeticism, we find the notion that by regulating the forces within us, we influence the forces of the universe around us. That is why mystics so emphasize self-control. It is not just a psychological benefit, but would be the key to tuning our entire life with a higher order. If inside I am troubled, my perception of the world will be troubled, and I will perhaps attract conflictive relationships and events. If inside clarity reigns, I will see solutions and paths where before there were obstacles. Likewise, mystical traditions speak of the necessary balance of internal polarities. In esoteric symbology, two columns that support the temple of wisdom are sometimes represented: a column of mercy and one of severity. This means that within us, compassion, love, empathy, sensitivity, and discipline, strength, limit, justice, must balance. If we only move by compassion without control, we can become excessively indulgent, weak, or vulnerable to being hurt. If we only act with rigid discipline and severity, we can become hard, cruel, or break inside. True self-control is the dynamic middle point between both extremes. It implies having the firmness to contain a harmful emotion, but also the sweetness not to drown our genuine emotions. Kabbalistic and Hermetic teachings suggest that at the heart of the tree of life, metaphor for the complete human being, lies the harmony that results from integrating opposing forces. Translated to our life, self-control flourishes when we unite head with heart, reason with emotion, consciously. Neither cold insensitivity, control without love, nor chaotic emotionality, love without control, but an alliance between both human aspects. For example, facing the earlier provocation, inner severity gives us the strength not to react by insulting, and mercy gives us the understanding to forgive the offense or respond kindly. When combined, the result is an assertive but respectful response, which avoids greater conflict and at the same time communicates our feelings. That is the masterpiece that mystics pursue within themselves. Many esoteric paths propose exercises and rituals of inner manifestation precisely to cultivate this mastery. Creative visualization is one of them. The person is invited to vividly visualize in detail the challenging situation, but seeing themselves reacting with total self-control, serenity, and effectiveness. By repeating this visualization, it is said that the unconscious mind assimilates that pattern as real, so that when the real situation arrives, we will already have an inner memory of how we want to behave. It's like magically rehearsing the scene in advance. In fact, this technique shares foundations with athletic or artistic training. An athlete imagines their perfect performance over and over to then execute it. Here, the scenario is life, and the performance is our emotional response. Internally manifesting our ideal reaction helps it manifest externally when the time comes. Another mystical practical tool is the use of symbols and talismans to anchor self-control. For example, in the Hermetic tradition, they spoke of engraving words of power or signs on an amulet to remind the person of their purposes. Today, we could translate this to something as simple as wearing a ring, a bracelet, or a special stone that upon seeing or touching it reminds us, stay calm, don't lose your center. That physical object is charged with intention and acts as a tangible reminder of our inner commitment. Similarly, some use affirmations, phrases, that they repeat silently in critical moments, a sort of personal mantra, like, I am master of my responses, or I choose peace in this instant. Far from being mere superstitions, these resources work because symbolic language communicates directly with our unconscious, where our automatisms reside. An adequate symbol can deactivate a reaction before it triggers, speaking to the deep part of the mind in its own metaphorical language. Within modern esoteric currents, we even find notions like psychotronics, which postulate that the human mind and energy can influence matter. Without entering debates about paranormal phenomena, this idea underscores something inspiring. Our mental intention has power. Experiments have been conducted, and anecdotes also abound, about how a person's emotional vibration impacts others and even their physical environment. Let us think of a space where a strong fight has just occurred. You could cut the air with scissors, it's often said, perceiving that residual tension. Or, conversely, places where someone has meditated or prayed in peace and one feels a special calm upon entering. It can be explained psychologically as suggestion, but from the energetic perspective, one would say that internal vibrations project outward. Thus, esotericists advise polishing our inner state not only for personal health, but to harmonize the environment we inhabit. An individual who practices self-control and equanimity radiates a different presence. They are that person who, in the middle of a crisis, seems to wrap others in their calm and comfort them. Isn't that almost magical? In a way, we can all develop that magic by cultivating our inner faculties. Self-control, concentration, visualization, prayer, different names for a similar process. Directing our mental emotional energy toward desired results, instead of letting it be wasted chaotically. In Gnostic traditions, for example, there is talk of awakening the inner divine spark to illuminate the darkness of existence. That spark could be interpreted as the consciousness capable of dominating the internal archons, which are our disordered passions according to that symbology. Knowing oneself, gnosis, implies recognizing both one's own light and shadow, integrating them and transcending them. This resonates much with the depth psychology of Carl Jung, who also drew from alchemical and mystical sources. Jung introduced the concept of the shadow. Everything about ourselves that we deny or repress becomes an unconscious entity that influences our life. Unexpressed anger, hidden fears, unconfessed desires, all of this composes the shadow. And while we don't recognize it, it will act for us without our knowledge. It will choose, for example, the moment to explode, or it will project onto other people, seeing in others defects that are actually our own. Jung warned, what is not made conscious manifests in our life as destiny. That is, that which we don't take conscious control of will somehow control us from the shadows, making us believe that that's just destiny, when in reality, we are repeating a pattern. Applied to self-control, if we don't make conscious the why of our outbursts of anger, we'll keep repeating them again and again, ruining bonds and opportunities. Lamenting, why does this always happen to me? But if we illuminate that shadow, for example, discovering that my excessive anger hides a deep fear of rejection I carry from childhood, at that moment, it stops governing us blindly. It's not that the impulse magically disappears, but by understanding it, we can channel it in healthier ways. In some, mystical wisdoms propose seeing self-control as part of a much broader process of soul growth. It doesn't stay in the superficial domain of behavior, but seeks a profound transformation of our being. It implies polishing ourselves as if we were a rough stone to reveal the inner gem. That gem is enlightened will, the higher self, some would say. Every time we resist the temptation to respond badly out of habit and instead choose to respond well out of love or understanding, we are forging that gem. It is continuous, almost sacred work, which can be supported by symbols, rituals, meditations, and universal principles. In the end, the goal of the spiritual alchemist or hermetic initiate is to achieve mastery of oneself, to become a living magnum opus, great work, in which every emotion has its correct and useful place, where nothing internal occurs out of order, but everything serves that person's highest purpose. While complete perfection may be an unattainable ideal, merely walking that path already brings enormous benefits. One doesn't need to be a mystic to verify it. It's enough to experience the satisfaction and inner dignity felt from having contained oneself in a difficult moment and having acted according to our deepest values. It's as if inside us a small alchemical sun were lit, radiating confidence, autonomy, and peace. Conclusion: integrating the science of self-control and the magic of transformation. Throughout this chapter, we have seen self-control under different lights, as a psychological muscle we can train, as a philosophical virtue that liberates, as a recurring theme in human narrative, and as a process of inner alchemy full of symbolism. By integrating all these perspectives, a rich and balanced understanding emerges of what it means to master oneself. On one hand, science and psychology teach us that self-control is largely a matter of mental habits. It requires identifying our automatic algorithms of thought and behavior to then modify them at will, as well as adjusting the cognitive interfaces through which we interpret the world. This gives us very powerful practical tools. We can implement conscious pauses, breathing exercises, mindfulness, cognitive restructuring, and other proven methods to improve our emotional management. We can also rely on the notion that the brain is plastic. Every effort to successfully control ourselves reinforces neural circuits of self-control, making it a little easier next time. Understanding ourselves in mechanical terms, without losing sight of humanity, allows us to de-dramatize the process. If one day we fail and lose composure, it's not that we're terrible and irredeemable, but that an old program ran. We can learn from the error, debug the code, and move forward without carrying useless guilt. On the other hand, philosophy and traditional wisdom remind us of the ethical and transcendent purpose behind self-control. Governing oneself has been considered the greatest of empires, an inner kingdom where one is sovereign and not subject. This inspires us to see it almost as a personal heroic feat. Every time we resist the temptation to respond to bad with bad, that we maintain temperance in the storm, we are affirming our freedom and strengthening our character. The voices of ancient masters whisper to us that therein lies authentic strength, and at the same time they warn us, beware of confusing self-control with cold repression. The middle way, serene balance, is the key. The goal is to feel fully, but with wisdom, to be able to enjoy life without chaining ourselves to any excess. This vision gives us a moral compass. We practice self-control not out of mere utilitarianism, but because we aspire to a good life, with fewer regrets and more harmony. Literature and art contribute the emotional and narrative dimension, helping us connect with our experiences through symbols and stories. We see ourselves reflected in characters who err and learn, in the metaphors of the labyrinth, the mirror, the dragon, the hero's journey. This nourishes our imagination and motivates us at a deep level. We can even create our own personal story. Why not conceive of ourselves as protagonists of a novel in construction, who traverse tests to conquer their inner treasure, peace, happiness? In this way, every challenge of self-control, Every avoided argument, every overcome harmful habit, every morning we defeat laziness becomes a victorious chapter of that intimate epic. Instead of seeing self-control as a deprivation or a dry struggle, we see it as a meaningful adventure toward our best version. Finally, the mystical perspective elevates us with the idea that in this inner work there is a kind of magic, of sacredness. Integrating this symbolic layer can make self-control transcend the merely psychological and also feel spiritual. It's not necessary to embrace any particular belief for this. It's enough to recognize that within us dwells something luminous, a center of consciousness capable of observing everything with love. From that spark of lucidity, we can contemplate our turbulent emotions like a moving sea, knowing that at the bottom of the ocean, everything remains calm. Thus, the act of self-control becomes a meditation. Will is the alchemist, emotion is the raw material, and consciousness is the fire that transmutes. When we manage not to yell despite being furious, or smile understandingly where before we judged, it's almost a magical act. We have transformed reality, at least the reality that mattered in that instant, that of our hearts and our interaction with the world. In that sense, acquiring self-control is like forging a flaming sword in the forge of the soul, a weapon with which we can win battles without hurting anyone, because those battles are against our own demons and not against others. Or perhaps more appropriately, it's like lighting an inner lantern that guides our steps in the darkness of any emotional labyrinth. With that light, we no longer walk blindly stumbling against the walls of anger or fear. Now we see the way out, or at least can orient ourselves better among life's turns. By integrating science with symbols, the mundane with the mystical, we discover that self-control is both an everyday skill to practice and an elevated art that dignifies our existence. It is the art of being, at once, the engineer who programs their mind, the philosopher king who governs their inner world with justice, the narrator who rewrites their destiny, and the magician who converts their states of being into creative energy. At the end of the day, self-control means that our decisions command more than our circumstances. It means we recover the helm of the ship of our life, that it will no longer be the capricious wind of momentary emotion that dictates where we go, but our will informed by reason and heart aligned. In simple words, self-control is freedom. The freedom to choose who to be in the face of what happens to us. The freedom to build, with patience and consciousness, that person we want to be, instead of reacting like automatons programmed by the past or by others. It is the greatest empire a human being can aspire to, and unlike external empires, this one cannot be taken from us by anyone. It is a power that grows the more we share it. When someone maintains calm and sanity in a crisis, they spread that stability to others, showing by example that it is possible to respond with humanity and not with violence.